My name is Robert Friend and welcome to NHCP's Leadership Matters conversation, an incredibly important session today on suicide prevention, reach out and save a life. My colleague Louise is also supporting today's session, providing technical support behind the scenes. So before I introduce today's keynote speakers, I just wanted to run through some logistics on how today's session is going to be facilitated. You will have noticed that when you join the session that your camera and microphones have been disabled. If you wish to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function and we will switch on your camera and microphone so that you can join us on the screen. Or alternatively, please post your questions in the chat box and we'll ask these on your behalf. We are also recording today's session so it can be shared with colleagues who haven't been able to join us today. Please do use the chat box function to share reflections throughout the session. So I'm delighted to be joined today by colleagues Paul Flecknoe and Lisa Pearson from Northamptonshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust, as well as Keith Waters from Derbyshire Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust. Today's session is about suicide prevention, and our aim is that by the end of the session, participants will feel more confident to reach out to someone who may be experiencing suicidal thoughts. We know that today's session can be emotive, so Lisa is on hand to monitor and respond to comments that have been posted in the chat box. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Paul.
Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to introduce Keith, who's very generously agreed to join us and speak today. And Keith Waters has worked with us in Northamptonshire for some years now, kind of guiding, advising, and sort of helping us sort of shape our suicide prevention work, both in the trust and in the county. Keith has got over 40 years of experience in self-harm and suicide prevention, and in 2013 was awarded an honorary research fellowship by Derbyshire Healthcare Foundation Trust, and for many years led the Derby site of the multi-centre study of self-harm in England, and was also previously the clinical director for self-harm and suicide prevention for Derbyshire, and has a seat on the National Suicide Prevention Alliance steering group. And that's only half his bio. I hope it's really evident that Keith is an absolute expert in this topic area, and we are very fortunate to have him. So thank you very much, Keith. And over to you. Just to very briefly say, just following on what Robert said, that we will allow some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. If you've got questions, there is some space in the session to that. So over to you, Keith, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. I'm quite flattered by your introduction. I often just view myself that for many years I was a liaison psychiatric nurse, working in an A&E department, seeing literally many thousands of people that came through, and they're the ones that have shaped me and my thoughts and my ideas and the various ways forward. It's a real pleasure to come to Northampton, although I used to really enjoy coming over in the real world, but I guess this is what we've got more used to. But I'm hoping once more that in the future we'll get a chance to meet up and chat again face to face. I want to take you through a kind of life journey, as it were, today. I'd like to share with you the context of change and developments that have occurred in my lifetime, really, in regard to self-harm and suicide prevention. And I make no excuses of putting the two together, of which we'll explore as the session progresses. So I hope it's not going to be too boring in a way to present it from a kind of national policies and development perspective, but I think it gives us an insight into the changes that have happened. I will mention some stuff later on about data, but what I want to do is to share with you what I think are the key themes and messages about suicide prevention, about self-harm work, etc., which hopefully will form the basis of discussions after Paul has presented something on your local perspective. So, last 60 years of self-harm. Well, and suicide prevention, I guess it starts in 1961, because prior to that, it was actually illegal to try to take your life, and people were, in fact, imprisoned for trying to take their life. And it's where this phrase, which we shouldn't be using regularly, committed suicide, seems to originate from, because of it being an illegal act previously. But there's a growing awareness that maybe that wasn't the right way to view suicide, and maybe it wasn't about, for want of a better phrase, a bad thing to do. It maybe was something more complicated and more complex than that. And I guess the development was then thinking that it was perhaps more to do with mental illness. The old phrase you probably heard from coroners, the balance of the mind disturbed, etc. So it's that kind of set the scene then in 1961 for what I think was a significant change. In 1984, a document was produced that actually said to health authorities that they needed to look at the care that they were giving for self-harm presentations, because what was becoming aware that many people with suicidal thoughts and ideation, and when they acted on it, were often attending places like the A&E departments, but there was little in the way of structures and processes to help to manage that. Now, you could say it was a real great development because people started to take this seriously. You could also argue that it was imposing quite a burden on resources, and therefore there was a way needed to try to manage that. And in many ways, professionally, that's where I first come into the equation, because I did a piece of work in our local area to actually look at that health notice and help to shape, to some extent, what the care was going to be provided in A&E for people who came in with self-harm, which was predominantly by overdosing. In 1992, we had our first target of suicide prevention, the first belief that maybe we can make a difference in suicide prevention. Now, the target was split into two bits, one about mental illness and one about the general population. But what was becoming aware was that it wasn't exclusively about mental illness. There were some other things that could be happening and could be changing. And maybe by setting a target, we could do something different. Lo and behold, we had a change of government, we had to have a change of wording, and it must have taken ages to change from the title of the health of the nation to our healthier nation. But in 1998, we had the development of the new targets that were there for suicide prevention, and the development of something that was called the National Service Frameworks, which looked at various component parts and what work could happen in order to look at suicide prevention. Moving on. NICE produced guidelines on the management of self-harm way back in 2004 with a clear understanding that every act of self-harm that comes to the attention of A&E or primary care or wherever should receive an assessment, because unless we know the story, we don't know what this is all about. And that was way back in 2004. In 2012, the prevention strategy was refreshed and renewed. The targets were kind of dropped at that place, but the indication was, again, to try to work to reduce the numbers wherever possible and to start to work to the idea of there were things that we can do that maybe help to save lives. In 2017, 5 years later, that strategy was updated, and we start to have the suicide prevention strategy having the word self-harm in it, not just about our highest risk group, but in terms of the strategies covering both self-harm as well as suicide prevention, because they are so closely interlinked. In 2018, NICE produced its first guidelines on suicide prevention, really geared about communities and prisons, etc., but it was a really important document. More recently, we've got in 2019 a cross-government work plan on suicide prevention. NICE produced again some guidelines on quality standards for suicide prevention. Though there have been regular updates on the strategy, and we have the fifth report, which really looks, the government were looking at what was the strategy, what was working well, and giving suggestions about how that could be altered and changed. And that was very, very useful. Much more recently, the National Suicide Prevention Transformation Programme, which I believe is headed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, received funding and is linked to the National Confidential Inquiry, was there to help to support initiatives and work that was going on, and monies were made available for pilots to be occurring across the country in terms of suicide prevention work. In terms of professionals in different settings, we have now a competency framework, an idea about what do staff need who are coming in contact with those who may be expressing suicidal thoughts. And again, it's not just about mental health staff, it's just about staff in contact with adults, it's staff in contact with younger people and staff in contact with older people. And it was a really useful framework to actually know what is it that we need to have the skills in order to engage with somebody who is struggling. Very recently, an update was done on what was called the consensus statement, the acknowledgement that friends, relatives and others play an important part, and we shouldn't be excluding them when we are thinking about suicide prevention work. And we have that dilemma about how we manage confidentiality, but what the persons need as well. Now, I think that the latest updated document helps us in that way, although I don't think it provides all the answers that are there. And you've heard a lot about the new online stuff that's happening, and very clearly in terms of self-harm and suicide prevention work for both young people as well as across all the age spectrum, we need to be addressing the difficulties that the online stuff poses, but not taking away the great benefits that a lot of the online material can provide. So we've got this progression, a progression that self-harm and suicide was perhaps something not right to be doing and it was inevitable and there's nothing you could do to produce a change, to a move that maybe it might be more about mental illness and therefore there was something about treatability of all of this, to where we are now in an understanding that maybe it provides us with an opportunity when somebody shares that they have suicidal thoughts or they're struggling in various ways. There's an opportunity and we need to believe that we can make a difference. And the difference isn't just about treatments in the medical sense, it's about addressing what problems and difficulties the person is facing and what might be of help for them to start to see things in a different light. So at the weekend, when I was planning this talk, I was going to present to you here now a lot of the data. But I was worried that I'd done a lot on strategies and that might be boring. And I didn't want to present you just with a lot of facts and figures. And to be honest, there's a lot of it out there. If you want to know, there's really good sources of information on both self-harm and suicide prevention. I've listed a few there. The ONS produces now regularly very good and quality data on both self-harm and suicide. We have the outputs from the National Confidential Inquiry, which in essence are dealing with those that are open to mental health services, but they've expanded out over recent years. And you can see the links with primary care, with other settings, etc., and the work they've done with GPs and others in trying to understand both suicide prevention work as well as self-harm work. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of the collaboration work, there are work streams that are out there, and in every area of the country there is some activity taking place in terms of the work streams, in terms of wave 1, wave 2 and wave 3 initiatives of looking at the suicide prevention work. But please, please remember, the facts and the figures only tell you about populations. They don't tell you about the person that's in front of you and what it means for them. It's about their story. It's useful to know some of the facts and figures, but the bit that guides what we can do to make a difference is what it means for that individual in the context of their situation. I was also going to present you something on the pandemic, but all I'm going to say is it hasn't actually caused what we suspected it might do, or what many that were, for want of a better word, fear-mongering and catastrophising about was saying that the pandemic would do. In fact, for a period of time, some of the rates of both self-harm and suicide were reducing, whereas previously they've been increasing. Now, things are levelling out now, and we shouldn't get complacent, but I think there are some really important messages to be thinking about. What was it about the pandemic that didn't, in fact, result as yet in an increase in self-harm or suicidal behaviour? Although distress and despair and difficulties out there in the community were without doubt quite prevalent. So this is my kind of caveat for the next section, as it were. This is the worldview of Keith in terms of suicide prevention. And I must acknowledge it's not necessarily going to be the view of the organisations that I work for, although I hope most of them are. But I just wanted to share with you what in my lifetime has shaped my thinking and my feelings about this, and the things that can hopefully make a difference for that. And so I'm privileged, and thank you to Paul for asking me to provide this kind of opportunity to share this with you. So here goes. I think, first of all, and fundamentally, the change is now thinking that suicide prevention is everybody's business. We can all do something about it. It's not passing this hot potato over to somebody else who we think is more expert in it. By being a human being with another human being, we can all start to make a difference. And I believe very much the same applies with self-harm, that it is everybody's business and we shouldn't just try to pass it over or move it around, that there are things that we can do with one human being that is struggling that we may be able to help in that sort of way. So let's just expand on that slightly. As a starting point, I believe very fundamentally that distress and despair are part of the human condition. It's normal for us all to be experiencing problems and difficulties in life, and they will all affect us in different ways. And in some ways, therefore, I'm not saying it's normal to self-harm, and I'm not saying it's normal to have suicidal thoughts, but it is fully understandable that that situation occurs. And therefore, if one is struggling with whatever is happening in one's life, the response isn't necessarily needed to be a mental health service response. If there is mental illness present or things that the mental health services can do, that is fine. But actually, there might be lots of other things that are leading to that distress and despair that, if they're addressed, may well help to shape and mould differently that person's views and that thing. Yes, thank you, Liz. I think it's important that we acknowledge that this could be quite triggering, and please take care yourselves in terms of what I'm saying today. So what we need to actually think about doing is understanding what might be the recent precipitants for that person's distress, but also the underlying factors and their life histories that there. We need to put their recent events that may be causing them the distress and despair in the context of their previous experiences, because we're all been moulded and shaped by what has happened in our lives to lead to where we are today. We need to be considering the vulnerabilities that may be present in the individual and how they may be mitigated for. We might not be able to take away or change all of those things that lead somebody to be vulnerable, but we might be able to do things to take the temperature down slightly of them, or to make them less traumatic or difficult for the person. But some of these human characteristics that we can do are really powerful. Kindness, compassion are actually powerful tools. And validating the individual and respecting them as an individual and their situation and how they're struggling and some reasons behind that are actually very powerful, and they're tools that can help us deal with somebody who is struggling and start to find a way forward. Suicide and self-harm are very closely interrelated in my view, and although somebody might self-harm without suicidal intention at that time, they are indeed within one of our riskiest groups for future suicide, because that link between self-harm and suicide is there. However, it's not an inevitability. You know, not everybody who self-harms goes on to self-harm again, and not everybody who self-harmed will go on to develop stronger suicidal thoughts or then act on them. But as a predictor in populations, they are one of our strongest connections that are there. So therefore, the expression of self-harm thoughts or actions, in the same way as the expression of suicidal thoughts, should be taken seriously on every occasion. Like the NICE guidelines in 2004 says, every act of self-harm should receive the opportunity of a biopsychosocial assessment. So in regard to self-harm, I'd like us to consider that self-harm is not a problem. It's a symptom, it's a flag waver that there is stuff that's happening that that person is struggling with. And therefore, the sort of attention and the sort of things that we can do that will make a difference will be trying to look at, explore and understand what are the problems that are leading to the symptom of the self-harm, because the self-harm is not a problem in its own right. And there isn't per se a treatment for the self-harm, although there are some things like CBT and others that can help with it, but they don't actually treat the self-harm. They treat maybe the thought processes, the mood, or the other bits, or the underlying processes that are occurring. And again, suicidal thoughts, for many years they were viewed to be a symptom of mental illness, but maybe that's not always the case. They can be in some depressions or some psychosis, that might be the case, but actually not wanting to be here could be considered as part of that human condition, and therefore we need to respect what that thought is about and not just assume that it's about mental illness and therefore a treatment in the mental illness sense is the way forward. It may be, but it may not be the only thing. And the stuff that we can do in terms of helping people with debt management, relationships, housing difficulties, etc., may be more life-saving than thinking of looking at a treatment for a depression that's there. That makes sense. So if we don't acknowledge and address the precipitants, how are we going to think about that person going to be able to cope with change? If the stuff that's causing them difficulties is not being looked into, how on earth can we expect that change is going to occur? Self-harm and high severity of suicidal thoughts should lower the referral criteria into services. This is a key controversial bit, and I appreciate that. But I worry that I hear about services that kind of say, oh, we're not going to be involved because they're self-harming and the risk of suicide is too great within all of that, where the needs clearly match that situation. Although I've said about mental illness earlier, I do think some mental illness services need to be thinking about lowering their criteria where self-harm and suicidal thoughts are present, because the risk is there that that might be acted on, and the risk is there the person may in fact take their life. One bit that's happening now very passionately around the country, and I know in your locality as well, is the acknowledgement of the role that safety plans play. Now, a safety plan isn't a care plan. It's a person's own plan of the things that they've agreed or they think or they would like to happen when they are struggling. Things that might distract them, people that they can talk to, places that they may be able to go to. So safety plans should be the response to any level of suicidal thoughts that are there. Now, the intensity and severity of the interventions may need to match the severity and the intensity of the suicidal thought, but the minimum response when somebody encounters health services, be that primary care or mental health services, and talk about some degree of suicidal thinking, is they should always be encouraged to, be supported to, or work alongside to have something called a safety plan, which actually can be quite a simple document, but a really important one about the things that that person can do to help to deal with any build-up of suicidal thoughts and things that might be there to help to make them safer. So again, just the final bit about me and things. Over the years, I picked up a variety of phrases which I've been accused of using quite a lot, and I've kind of christened them, as it were, Keithisms, as it were. But I think they emphasise some of the key messages that I think as healthcare professionals and social support professionals we need to be thinking about and helping to shape what we do and how we do it. So here goes. In terms of risk assessment, a starting point is nothing predicts behaviour better than previous behaviour. However, people are fickle and we can and do change. So it might be useful as a starting point to be thinking of that, but actually don't over rely on that. In terms of our self-harm work, we've identified that, people are equally likely to change their method that they often use to a different method as they are to stick with the same method. So it's very easy to be lulled into a false sense of security that the person's self-harm method has been one that they've used that has generally been non-medically serious and non-life threatening, and therefore the risks are low. No, they're not, because the next time they could change their method, and people do change their method as equally often as they do stick with the same method. So it's a good starting point when you're trying to look at risk, looking at that previous behaviour and actions, because nothing might predict behaviour better than previous behaviour, but be really careful that that isn't your main driver, because people are fickle and we can and we do change. A pain is what the person says it is. I nicked this from our pain management clinics when I used to have a lot of involvement with them, and I want to apply it in terms of distress and despair in the human condition. We can't say to somebody, oh, your pain is less than that person's, or I don't think it's quite as bad as you say it is. We need to, I believe, have a starting point is pain is what the person says it is for them, and therefore we need to appreciate where they're at. Now, whether or not they're affected by personality disorders or other things that you think are interfering with their expression of that, in reality, the starting point for me is pain is what the person says it is, and starting from that point with them. How can we validate them? How can we be treating them compassionately if we undermine what it is that they're telling us and the way in which they're coming and sharing what we're about? Without doubt, one of the best tools that we have to help to reduce suicide is restricting access to means, and it's one of our best tools that we have in order to save life. Because in reality, and again, a bit of a harsh phrase, apologies for this, what kills people is not how much they want to die at the time of them doing something, it's what means they have access to and what they then use. And therefore we can and do have the opportunity to change those things or to help to modify and alter them. And we all are in that position. How many of us at home have got old medications that we've not used for a long time? We've got it on prescription, we've paid for it, so it's ours, isn't it? It might come in handy some other time. Actually removing from everyone's house stuff that they no longer need might be a good suicide prevention strategy, because I don't know tonight whether or not I might become disturbed and distressed over something, whether somebody visiting my home might become disturbed and distressed over something, and therefore if they aren't lethal means easily available, the person still might do something, but it will be able to come through that, as opposed to it unfortunately proving fatal. Wow, this is complex. The whole area of suicide prevention, understanding it, as well as for self-harm and understanding what it's about, what it might mean for the person, the ways forward, is highly complex, and it can feel really overwhelming. But in reality, a lot of the stuff that can make a difference is in fact the very simple stuff. Talking to each other, asking the questions, validating people, removing access to means. There's lots of very, very simple stuff that can make a huge difference to what looks like a very complex and overwhelming area. And in terms of those approaches, those of you that will have been in nursing a little while, not many years ago, we had the 3 C's about compassion and other things as well. Well, I nicked some of that and I call it the Keith 2 C's when we're trying to understand that complex situation. Let's try and put things in context and actually acknowledge the chronology as well. That if we can build up the step-by-step picture of how somebody has got to where they're at. If you can work it with the person, that's even better. You allow that chronology to inform the context about what's happening now. So that row with the boyfriend and girlfriend isn't really only about the row with the boyfriend and girlfriend. It may be a combination of the losses, abandonments and rejections that have occurred early on that had led to the vulnerability of this person. Story, story, story. I keep saying it, and it's so important. Those 2 C's will help us to understand that person's story. And if we've got that understanding, it's because they've given us that understanding. And in some ways, we can reflect with the person that understanding. And that can be a very powerful tool in helping the person understand what it's about. Because underpinning all of this is the bit about being a human being and listening and taking seriously and validating that person. So compassion, in the broad sense of the word, which includes both sympathy and empathy and other component parts like non-judgmental approaches, etc. Validating the person in terms of their history, their story, what they're thinking and what they're feeling, what their level of pain is and what their distress is, and treating that with respect, I believe are really powerful tools that should be shaping what we're doing and how we're doing and any approaches and services and interventions that we do. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope in some ways it's provided some interesting thought that Paul will possibly now be able to build on in the context of the stuff that's happening within your locality. So thank you for that, and I look forward to to sharing thoughts, ideas and questions towards the end. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. I'm just going to quickly share my slides. So as much as possible, I'm going to try and build on that very sort of eloquent overview that Keith has just sort of shared with us, and talk a little bit about our work in NHFT as a trust predominantly. But just this first slide is to draw a bit of attention to the fact that in every sort of regional area in the UK, we are being asked to form a suicide prevention partnership on the basis, as Keith was saying, that this is now seen as a whole community, everybody's business sort of topic. And so this diagram, I quite like this because I think it captures that and sort of provides a kind of visual sense of how to really maximize effectiveness. It needs to involve that wide range of organisations. So as a healthcare provider, we are one part of that jigsaw. So I'm just going to talk about that one part of the jigsaw a little bit. So in our trust, what have we done is basically the bit I'm going to try and talk a bit more about. And I think linked to what Keith was saying, and also you will have kind of gathered at the beginning, there is absolutely a plethora of guidance and new information and evidence, at times feeling like it's being produced all the time, every month. There's often something new. So we've formed a suicide prevention strategy group for the trust, and that's provided a very useful network of interested clinical staff, administrative staff, managers, and we've also been fortunate to have sort of experts by experience join us in that group as well. So that's been our kind of hub to share this information, to share sort of learning and ideas and initiatives, and try and drive some of that work in the trust as a whole. And I think it's worth saying that we're very much thinking about a strategy as a provider of services, but we are also increasingly thinking about a strategy as an employer of people. And I think that's become more pronounced during the pandemic, when, as you all know very well, healthcare staff, as well as lots of other people, have come under sort of particular pressure. So we've tried to develop a bit of an identity for the suicide prevention work in the trust. So we've called it Protect, and you can see the sort of visuals that have been developed to go with that. And Protect is a kind of acronym, and like all acronyms, we've had to shoehorn it a little bit in to make it a sort of word that you would recognise. But that slide kind of summarises a little bit some of the sort of themes within our thinking around the approach. And then over the last few years, really, we've developed a few priority areas. And the one of them is a very simple but very important one, and it's sort of represented in the fact we're having this event today, and we've had many sort of similar initiatives in the trust itself, which is simply to push up the priority of the topic and to literally and metaphorically put it on the agenda. So a little bit in some ways like safeguarding has become, we're really encouraging people to think about suicide prevention as part of their routine kind of business of both providing services and employing staff. And so when we're making changes or when we're planning things, suicide prevention is one of the considerations of that sort of strategic bit of work. And we've mirrored that by doing short presentations and teaching sessions from sort of board to frontline delivery to share some of the latest information that's coming out, but also to engage people a bit more around the topic. Picking up on what Keith said, mental health services in particular have a sort of tradition of talking about risk assessment, and I think often it's still a widely believed thing that a mental health professional can ask lots of clever questions and predict someone's risk of suicide. And what we're learning is, in reality, that is notoriously difficult to do at an individual level. So you can talk about populations being more at risk, but at an individual level, prediction is very, very difficult. And so this more safety netting approach of encouraging the safety planning conversation is another piece of work we've been encouraging in the trust. And Keith also mentioned a bit about the involvement of families. So that's another theme that shows up all through the literature and showed up in some of our own internal reviews. And so we've been doing sort of specific work thinking about how we better involve and more sort of systematically involve families in the delivery of our care. So we've also looked a little bit about how we approach learning from serious incidents and making sure that the lessons from those incidents are properly sort of reflected in the sort of suicide prevention work and suicide prevention strategy in the trust. And we're also looking at how staff themselves are supported in the event of somebody dying by suicide, which often for healthcare staff and mental health care staff is often for them very deeply distressing. And at the same time, the organisation is trying to find a way to learn from those kinds of events. So it's sort of working out a way to both support the staff and enable that learning to take place. I think Keith's covered much of the guidance, so just wanted to mention very briefly The dilemma for staff around involving families often does centre on some concerns around confidentiality and their duties around confidentiality. This slide is about useful national guidance, and we've done some work in the trust to turn that into a kind of trust version, which has been called common sense confidentiality. And then just a few specific developments, and then I think I'll stop and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So we've created a dedicated suicide prevention training lead role in the trust in terms of sort of a specific change, and that person is leading on delivering a training package called Storm, which, as Keith was sort of talking about, helps people develop confidence and develop skills in asking those detailed questions to understand the person's story, the chronology and the context, and to support them and the service to make a plan of safety and for the person to make their own safety plan. We've worked to make mental health services in particular more accessible, so it's now possible for people to self-refer and to directly contact mental health services 24 hours a day, whereas previously there were lots of different routes in, many of them through primary care or through other means. There's been increased investment into sort of key service delivery areas, and some of those you can see on the slides, such as early intervention psychosis, perinatal mental health and complex PTSD. And then the other thing that we're very excited about is we're creating peer support worker and around the family involvement theme, carer peer support worker roles in our community mental health teams. And carer support workers are people with lived experience, so people have themselves been carers, who have developed expertise from living it, who are then employed as in a support worker role to work both with the mental health team but also with the carers and the families of the people that the trust is providing services to. And I think one of the ambitions around that is that will provide more of a focus and sort of amplify the voice and the perspective of families and carers in the provision of care. So I think that's there's much more I could say, but I think I would rather leave the space for Q&A, and then we can pick up in a way what's of interest to people rather than go through lots and lots of slides. So I will pause and turn off my stop sharing my screen at that point.
Brilliant. Thank you both, Paul and Keith, as well. You know, as we say, it's such an important topic, and actually to just hear nationally and locally what's happening as well. So thank you for presenting and taking us through that. I think it's now, as you say, opportunity for a discussion. Any questions? So if anyone does want to ask any questions, please use the raise your hand function and we'll put you on screen. Or if you want to post your comments into the chat. Okay, so I think Chris got your hand up, so I think Louise will just disable the cameras.
Chris, you should be able to unmute and come on now.
Can you hear me? Yeah, there we go. Hi, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is a difficult subject, and as Lisa said in the chat box, you know, it clearly might raise issues for individuals. I just wanted to, if I may, start the ball rolling and to say, first of all, my name's Chris Davison. I'm the lead governor with NHFT. For those of you who don't know what governors do, we are volunteers, but we have two statutory duties. One is to hold the non-executives to account for the performance individually and collectively of the board, and the other, we represent members and also members of the public. So to a certain extent, we have a foot in the NHS, but also a foot in the community. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of the council, both Keith and Paul for skillfully and expertly taking us through this difficult subject. And I'd like to share with you, if I may, a couple of stories that bring this to life. So, as I say, I have a foot in the community, and I represent 170,000 people here in Kettering and Corby, so as well as lead governor and public governor for Kettering and Corby. I've had 4 conversations with members of the public who were struggling with suicidal thoughts and ideations, and at that moment were really in the grip. In a previous life in the NHS, I had undertaken suicide prevention training, and I couldn't endorse even further what you just said, Keith, about the need to validate individuals. They need to feel attended to. People need to be listened to. We need to express empathy. And when you bear in mind that 55% of all communication is non-verbal, when you find somebody in that position, whether you're a healthcare professional, me, when you're in the public, you've got to do it very carefully. And I'd like to share with you one story that brought this to life for me. I was on holiday in Bath. I have a faith, and I went to Bath Abbey and I lit a candle, and I noticed out the corner of my eye a couple, probably in their mid-30s, where his partner, wife, girlfriend, whatever, was literally hanging on to him for dear life. And just in that moment, as you said, of human being to human being, I lit the candle, I turned to him and I said, God bless you and keep you. And in that split second, he said to me, can you help me, please? I'm struggling with suicidal thoughts. I'm struggling with suicidal thoughts. Now, I had to immediately think as an NHS manager, okay, where do I go? The open plan nature of Bath Abbey is such I could take him over there. And I spent 30 minutes just listening to him. He actually said he thought I was one of the chaplains. I said, no, I'm a holiday maker. And after half an hour, where I might push back if I may, Keith, with a couple of examples, I do believe that whilst the COVID pandemic has not necessarily shown those statistics, it turned out that this man who had a story, young man, he was an international DJ, going all over the world, globe-trotting. His whole world had come down. He'd lost his meaning, he'd lost his purpose, it'd gone. And I was able to access the UCAT services for Bath NHS, the mental health service provider, and cut a long story short, I was able to signpost him and get a call in. I sat with him until such time as he was able to access that service. The other initiative that I've set up here in Kettering is a health and wellbeing pop-up shop. This was on the basis of my passion of bringing health to the high street, because I firmly believe that people are struggling coming out of the pandemic. They just don't know where to go. And I've worked your side of the table at a senior level. I know what it's like. That we do signpost people, but there's a lot of people who are struggling with debt, with housing problems. And there were 2 members of the public who opened up about their own suicidal thoughts and ideation, and it all came from a conversation. How are you? How did you find the pandemic? How are things at home? And what was interesting is that a couple of the volunteers that help at the shop said, what you provide is a safe space. We assume people are comfortable with going to a clinical area. They're not necessarily comfortable with going to a clinical area. So all I would say, just sharing those personal stories, is that it is about validating the individual. As you say, people need to feel attended to listen to, attended to. And it is about our body language and how we do it. It's very easy to move people on, but just listen to them and demonstrate. And I said to both of these people who were struggling, I said, you know what, that's fine. It's fine. I said, many of us, 1 in 5 of us have had suicidal thoughts. And I said, I myself have had them. Doesn't mean that, you know this better than I do about passive and active and all of that stuff. But outside of the NHS, it's those conversations we have with the public. And I believe as governors, we can get to places that you can't. So, Paul, my plea to you is to think about in your strategy is about utilising us as a council and equipping us as governors, because our role is to represent the public. And it is about early intervention. And the whole point we can do, and I'll finish on this point, is about challenging stigma, tackling stigma, challenging prejudice and raising awareness, because we assume people know where to go. But 2 of the people that came to the pop-up health and wellbeing shop didn't even know that the services existed. And I was able to signpost them to the crisis cafes, which is another local initiative, made a phone call to Kettering Mine, and we were able to sort one of those individuals out straight away. They had an appointment that afternoon. So thank you for letting me address the meeting. I think in and of itself, these sort of conversations are really important, really important. You guys are the professionals. You work in the health service, you deal with people who are referred, but there's a big community out there. And I would make a plea that as a council, we are involved in some of those initiatives and developments. Thank you again.
Can I respond, Paul? Is that?
Please do, yeah.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I think you gave us some really important reasons why those messages are very powerful about taking each other seriously, listening to the story and validating the individual. In regard to the pandemic, I in no way underplay that distress and despair and difficulties have increased during the pandemic, and now voluntary sector organisations tell us about, you know, the growth in the number of calls and demands upon them, which actually show that distress and despair is there, and we should never take our eye off the ball in this, because although we have had lower numbers or no growth anyway in terms of the rates, we shouldn't become complacent with all of that, because there's a lot there. But there's stuff there that maybe people are a little bit more in tune with each other's needs, having all gone through difficulties. We may be reaching out a little bit more. Although the internet has a not a nice side to it, it has a really positive side as well. And people being able to communicate, get in touch with each other and others have been things that have happened much more naturally during the difficulties. So we can learn some of the positives from things that have probably been helpful and protective during that. But please, we mustn't get complacent, because as you found, there are people out there that are struggling, and unless we're reaching out and trying to help them to work through what it is that they're finding their distress and despair is originating from, you know, the outcomes are quite worrying. So thank you for that, Chris. I think it was a really powerful explanation of some of the key concepts, and thank you for what you're doing as well.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks.
And could I just sort of add a couple of things to that? So just to say, I mean, one of the statistics I guess we didn't look at is, some people on the call might not be aware that, but roughly, I think around 70% of the people who die by suicide are not in contact with mental health services. So actually, the bigger community bit is absolutely, you know, if we're going to make progress, it absolutely isn't just about statutory formal mental health provision. And I think that sort of example really, Chris, of that, I suppose that theme of reaching out and that first step of reaching out seems to me a really common kind of theme in some of the sort of high profile stories that you might have come across of people that have been saved. So there's the Stranger on the Bridge, the Johnny Benjamin documentary, which was literally a passerby seeing somebody who looked distressed and asking if they're okay, and just keeping them talking. This wasn't a specialist. This was literally somebody who was on their way to work, I think. And then I think the role of the governors, and as you know, I'd be very happy to speak about this separately. Sounds as though that could be very useful, certainly with the trust, but I also think linking you into the public health chaired county-wide bit, because the bit I've spoken about is just the trusts bit, and I think there's something about the whole county that fits some of that more community-focused stuff that you are pointing us at, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
I can't see any further questions on the chat. I've put some information in there. I just really wanted to highlight as well, if you're interested and you're wanting to get some more information or some training, that the Zero Suicide Alliance training is an excellent package of free training. It's 20 minutes long. On World Suicide Prevention Day, what we did as a trust was actively encourage all our staff to take part in that, and we had quite a good reception from that, so something to consider. So I'll try and put the link in chat, but I've put that in chat as well.
Could I just respond? I know it's not framed as a question, but Nicole sort of said about support for staff around incidents, and I think it's worth saying, Nicole, this is being looked at the moment, actually as part of the sort of staff wellbeing work streams in the trust, but obviously it links to suicide and self-harm prevention. And if that's something you're interested in, please do reach out to Lisa or I, and we'd welcome some involvement in that from people who are working in sort of clinically facing roles, because we are keen to look at what we've got and how good it is, and maybe what's missing and what we could improve on. So that's literally being there's a group looking at that right now. So if that's of interest, please do get in touch with us.
Can I just say I'm mindful this is being recorded and somebody might now be watching this as a recording, and therefore if there are some questions that you think I might be able to have a help with or what have you, I can't guarantee I have an answer to anything, but I don't mind if you contacted Paul or Lisa, and then that was a vehicle through to myself if you wanted to share things, because it's also not always easy in these public arenas to pose a question, because it is a sensitive area as well. So that's just a kind of reaching out to anybody who here today maybe have a question but not sure about actually posing it in the public arena, but certainly those that are listening to this as a recording, if they've got some question that they want to pose. Thank you.
We've got a question about peer support working, and could you expand on the work of peer supporters and how they could help in suicide prevention?
Do you want me to start, Keith, or would you like to? Yeah. Shall I start with that? So Patsy, so there's peer support workers, and then we've also created carer peer support workers, and we're recruiting to both at the moment. And so broadly speaking, but in both cases, peer support workers are people who have gone through their own journey from a lived experience point of view. So peer support workers would have had some sort of mental health condition or challenge that they have recovered from, and recovery means learning to live with rather than necessarily all the condition of the experience is disappearing. And carer peer support workers would have been in a position of looking after someone or being a family member in contact with somebody in that position. And the way I think they help is sort of linked to the whole question of how co-production helps. And co-production, for people who are not familiar with it, and I know lots of you will be, broadly is sort of broadening and rethinking a bit about what expertise or what types of expertise there are. So there's we talk a bit about experts by training, so people who've sort of perhaps done a professional training or therapeutic trainings, so somebody with a background like myself or Keith or Lisa, but also there's a expert by experience. So this is somebody who's got expertise because they've lived through and had personal experience of both the condition and also often of the services that are provided. And the richness that comes from that, in my experience, is when you put those two different but equally valuable types of knowledge and sort of expertise together. And early in some of the suicide prevention work we were doing, for example, work on our inpatient units, and we were inviting conversations about how could we make the units safer, how could we help maximise the prevention of suicide in these spaces. And staff had a perspective, and it was a useful perspective, and people with lived experience expertise had a different perspective. And what was fascinating is how different but complementary they were. So the staff tended to be a bit more focused on reducing access to means, looking at the environment, policies and procedures, some of those and kind of formal kind of risk assessment type perspectives. And the people who had lived experience were saying the thing that made the difference to me was the way that person spoke to me, or the way that particular person really seemed to care about me or wanted to know a bit more or ask me a question in a particular way. And so I think both those things can make a difference. And as Keith said, actually reducing access to means is one of the most evidence-based ways to reduce the risk of suicide. But also I think it just blends perspectives and sort of helps increase the sort of richness of the conversation, really. For carer peer support workers, I think in community teams, which tend to be organised around the individual, they are a very valuable sort of asset to both offer a person whose job it is to look at and engage with the family specifically, and sort of be the person that prompts the team to hold the family in mind, which a lot of adult services and indeed our culture is organised around the individual. And so I think just by the existence of somebody whose job it is to think family in that context, that also makes a difference. I hope that's of some help. I don't know if Keith or Lisa want to add anything.
I'm happy to add some thoughts. I've seen some really good examples of peer support workers working very, very well, and having somebody alongside you who has some similarities and experiences, but has now come through that and can help work through is very, very powerful. But I've also seen times when it's been tricky as well. And I guess it links to that question about staff as well. When you are exposed to, when you are alongside traumatic events and difficulties there, they have an effect on us as an individual as well. So we do need to make sure that not only are we supporting our frontline staff and making sure that they're okay, but if we have workers like peer support workers or family workers within all of that, we make sure that they are okay and have ways of telling their story and working through. I do like the idea, though, as well of, and whether it be a peer supporter, but of having somebody alongside you to help navigate what often is a very complicated and confusing system. It's not necessarily having a wonderful professional skill or expertise, but it's being there and being helped to work through the various contacts, because it can be so demoralising. You know, what's the referral criteria? What time does somebody work? What are the things? What will they do? What won't they do? And if you are struggling, and particularly if you're in distress and despair, navigating through that is an absolute, it's almost impossible to do. So having somebody alongside you doing that, like a mentor or a supporter, etc., of which peer support roles can be part of that. But I think there's something we can expand more than just peer support type workers for those who are experiencing distress and despair. We've got the Samaritans, they are there, but it's somebody alongside you, kind of holding your hand through this complicated maze that might be in front of you to try to sort out. Thank you, Paul.
Got no further questions in the chat at the moment, I can see.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So I mean, we'll wrap up the session, but if anyone does have any other questions that they want to just post into the chat, we can get responses back to you as well. Again, I just want to say a massive thank you to both Keith and Paul for attending and joining us on today's session, and for those of you that have also shared in the chat as well and asked questions. I do appreciate that a number of links have been posted in the chat with regards to support groups, etc. And these aren't going to be visible to those that are watching on demand. So we will explore whether we can add these links to the web page where the recording will be hosted on the NHCP website as well. So I'm just going to share my screen for a couple of slides. So in the chat, my colleague Louise is just going to post a link to Slido with regards to some feedback for today's session. I shall post that. And then just a reminder that our next session is on the 16th of November. It's about shaping digital health and social care in Northamptonshire. This session will be facilitated by our keynote speakers Paula Love and Pedro Santos, who are going to be exploring how the digital revolution has changed our world. So the long-term vision for health, social care and housing sees a huge opportunity for using modern digital technology to transform the way our services are provided. So it's going to be a really interesting session, looking around how we can use this digital technology. Further information can be found on the event page. So please do have a look, and we will circulate information as well to those that have attended today's session. So finally, just a thank you to everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. So a massive thank you to everyone.